Thank you very much for being with us today in Intersections, and it's a really an honor. We've been following from afar and seeing what you and your associates do, and basically what we want is to let our audience and our network to get to know a little bit more about you, what you do, and basically your perspective in terms of sports investing and sports business in general.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me. Yes, I am a investor and executive in several European football clubs. I have a small minority investment in a club in the UK, Swansea City, a small minority investment in a club in the Republic of Ireland called Dundalk Football Club. And the project that I spend the most time on, I'm the managing partner and chairman of a club in Denmark called FC Helsingør. So yeah, it's a unique space. There's very few, certainly Americans out there that are focused solely on European football and ownership and running these clubs. But my background is I owned a company in the secondary ticketing space here in the United States, ticketing and technology company. And when I sold that business 5 or 6 years ago, I played soccer here in the United States growing up. I really found the business side of the sport really interesting and that there were so many opportunities, which I'm sure we'll talk about a little bit later in the conversation. So yeah, no, happy to talk more and answer any questions you guys have.
Yeah, excellent. So basically, your connection comes from the love of the game, right? In terms of being a player, and I suppose that as a player, the European influence, it's either aspirational or basically just startling in terms of how the game is played and all the stars and kind of all the tales of winning and championships and glory. From the business perspective, I mean, you come from the tech world and investing. How you make that translation of actually taking this as a serious investment route, I would say, in terms of getting into business in football.
Yeah, I mean, people know that many football clubs, particularly in Europe, are not run particularly efficiently or professionally. So I think a lot of, my experience, running, in the business world very much translates because at the end of the day, a football club is a business, right? We have to pay employees and payroll taxes and insurance and all the kind of the funds, the not super fun stuff off the field that most people don't think about. That's running a business. And so I think on one hand, I think my background and skill set translates pretty well to running a football club. On the other hand, I think, this is a people business, whether that's hiring a coach or a sporting director or players or creating a culture or an environment at your club. And I think, certainly that's no different than creating culture in an organization, whether that's a technology company or whether that's a football club. So I think sometimes people get into the management and ownership of football clubs or sports clubs in general, and they kind of turn their brain off and they don't act rationally and they start to make poor decisions. And I think the thing that is put me in a good position to be successful, I think, is being able to translate a lot of the skills I had outside the football world inside of football. And of course, not everything's translates, but I think it's been a pretty smooth transition for me.
Yeah, definitely. There are, it's something that is very known, and with associates, partners that are also looking into investing and facilitating financing to our clubs, which is another part of the conversation that we'll take. Basically, the what we identify in our conversations is that the barriers or basically the walls that as a manager or from a management perspective you have to face is the element of passion. We saw some of that recently with the Super League, and I'll want to have your take on that. But the reality is that, when probably it's very difficult to be able to rationalize the management of a club and make the stakeholders understand that one thing is that part that guarantees the sustainability of the operation of the club, and in this case with the fans, that they love their clubs, right? That sustainability is what makes their club continue to compete and so on, with a losing streak, and how fans can get loud in the stands and boo you or want you out. So it's different, and it's something that, at least from my perspective, certain American sports business professionals kind of don't translate very well into the European reality, because pretty much you don't have the great monsters around sports, which are probably relegation, promotion, and that disruption of your business plan so markedly showcase when your team is not performing. But what is your take on that in terms of how you can balance rational, and especially coming as an expat or a foreign owner or manager, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult. The European football model is so very different from North American sports. And I think it's important that any investor coming into European football, certainly from the US, has a good understanding of what the system in place is in terms of, you're right, promotion, relegation, or even just the general way Europeans look at the sport in terms of the cultural immersion and the emotional attachment to the sport. I think, I've talked about this previously, like it's difficult to balance it, right? Because any investor who's putting money into a club or a business is going to want a return on their investment. I do think you talk to people in and around European football and they believe to a day that this shouldn't be a business. You shouldn't try to make money. And my response to that is, well, no one's going to put money in a football club and the whole football economy will collapse, right? But on the other hand, you have groups, some American groups that come in and they're so financially focused of just bringing every penny out of this club and business, and they don't understand the emotional side of it and the passion side of it. So I think, my goal with the way I work with my investments is to try to balance that in terms of saying, look, we have to run this like an efficient business. We have to make good, smart, sound decisions. We ultimately need to make money, but at the same time, not every decision should be driven by solely making money. We have to be aware and sensitive to the cultural differences between the sports and aware that European football is different. And again, like I've said this before, if someone wanted to get the maximum return on their investment from putting money into something, they shouldn't put it into a European football club or sports in general, right? There are better ways to get a return on your investment, right? So the idea is, can you have fun? Can you have enjoyment? Can you make some money? Can you do all those things at the same time without skewing too much in one direction? It's a difficult balance, but it's something that, at least in my personal investment thesis, I try to hit that balance right as much as possible.
Yeah, and actually going into that and the pure management of things, like everything kind of comes down to value generation, right? No matter what the business you are, you need to create an environment or an operation that generates value, and value translates into sustainable business and so on. How do you see football from the current perspective of 2021 and what's ahead globally coming forward? Which are kind of the highlightable value pockets that people into the business need to look at?
Yeah, I mean, the three areas you focus on in terms of how do you turn this into a value-driven business, in terms of obviously developing and selling players. And, everyone talks about wanting to do that. How do you actually do that? Is that developing a really strong academy? Is it having an international recruitment base? Is it having a strong domestic recruitment base? Like, how do you actually do that? So that's obviously number one. Number two is, leveraging, for instance, the promotion and relegation system. Can you buy a club in a lower division like we did in Denmark and get it promoted? And that's how you add value. Your club will go from being valued X to 5X. Your revenue will be going from X to 10X, right? Because of the television rights and whatnot. And then I think on the third hand, it's also about, are there just undervalued assets, clubs that are being run poorly, clubs that might be on the verge of bankruptcy, clubs that can be just, if you come in with a more professional management team, can they be run better? And then that's a value proposition for you. So those are like the three main areas. Of course, you can come in and you can internationalize any club in terms of building a global brand. You can, try to sell more tickets and more sponsorships. But I think those are the three main areas that I would say are the most focused on for driving revenue.
Yeah, and some things that kind of come up, it doesn't apply to every case, are kind of potential real estate related type of investment coming into a club, the development of an area of the stadium, and what it's a very American angle in terms of new stadiums that are, let's say, multi-purpose venues, entertainment venues, but also that has been in some cases a boon for the investors or the owners of the club, be it the fans or.
I would say on that front, I think Europe lags significantly behind North America when it comes to leveraging sports franchises for real estate value. I mean, most for clubs in Europe, the stadiums that they have, they're not owned by the club. They're owned by the municipalities or local governments. So it can be very difficult to monetize any sort of real estate assets. In North America, it's totally the case in terms of almost every stadium that's built has some sort of real estate component attached to it. Could that change in the future? Possibly, but it's definitely not a huge business model in Europe at this moment.
Yeah, definitely. And when you see those cases, it usually is kind of in your area of influence, right? Up north in the UK in some cases, and some other Central European or Nordic countries. It's interesting for us to understand a little bit of why those are probably the focus area for you and your group in terms of finding those assets and develop those.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I knew there was going to be a lot of challenges and difficulties coming into European football as a foreign investor. I knew other groups, I'd read other groups, stories about other groups that had come in and really struggled in European football. And so I felt like I wanted to make investments in places where it was relatively easy to do business. So certainly number one was places that people spoke English for the most part. That was a big first step. I think it's a pretty big mistake that, let's just say, American groups, they go into France or Italy or Spain where there's a pretty significant cultural difference, both on the language and culture in terms of the way business is done. So we've certainly had our own challenges going into a place like Denmark, but they've been a lot less, I think, than going into other places. And so, we wanted to, Denmark specifically has a very good culture of developing young players. Most clubs and businesses in Denmark are really well run and efficient. So again, it was just coming about, can we have a good landing spot as one of our first big investments in Europe to have a relatively easier place to do business? And once we prove that we can do that well, then we can move on to a place, let's just say, that's more difficult.
Yeah. And in your case, you operate, 3 clubs in 3 different markets. Your first investment was Swansea or the club in Denmark?
Yeah. So my first investment was, again, just a small minority investment in Swansea and then a small minority investment in Dundalk in Ireland. So I have no involvement in the day-to-day operations of those clubs. It's just a passive investment. And then Denmark, we got into Denmark about 2 years ago.
But you took some learnings in terms of, you've been exposed as a minority investor, nevertheless, but in terms of how to do that in Denmark.
Yeah, no, I mean, the first probably 6 to 8 months that I invested, my first investment was just Swansea. I spent a lot of time on the ground. I went to a lot of games, tried to learn, soak up as much information as I could about how the club was run, what the club did well, what the club maybe could do better. And I've definitely translated a lot of those learnings to my day-to-day operations in Denmark, which I obviously have full control over.
Yeah, definitely. Now, and in terms of the perspective, we touched a little bit on the things that American investors need to be aware in terms of coming into Europe to invest, the difference between the management model. But if you look at it from the other perspective in terms of, clubs or current owners that are willing to open part of their equity to foreign groups, what should be the criteria in terms of, picking the people that you want to partner with in terms of welcoming that investment?
Yeah, I think most current owners, depending on who they are and where they come from, are looking for good caretakers at the club, because a lot of owners still to this day in European football are local individuals who live in these communities. So if they bring in an investor, whether they're foreign or not, who runs the club into the ground, or the club goes bankrupt, or it's just really poorly run, that's not going to reflect well on the prior ownership. So I think one of the big conversations I have most times with potential prospective clubs that are looking to sell, so they're looking for the right kind of people that are going to take care of the club. And I don't think it's something a lot of people think about. They just assume owners are just going to take the biggest check they can find, which that is a component to it. But really, it's important that, especially if an owner has been at a club for a very long time and they have a strong legacy, they want that legacy to be continued so that all the things, the goodwill they've built up in the club can be continued on into the future.
Yeah, absolutely. And now going a bit broader, and to recent news in terms of the Super League and all that, which had I wouldn't say 100% because we know kind of the interest story right now by now, right? But had a good dose of American influence in terms of how it was. The first question that it comes, even though from the business perspective, the hypothesis under which the Super League might work, or how it was proposed, could make sense. I personally been working a lot in the basketball world here in Europe, and yearly basketball has that model similarly, but it has been 21 years in the making. It wasn't a press release overnight to actually create it. Yeah. But what is your take on the proposal, and where do you think it failed in terms of gaining at least some consideration in the court of public opinion?
Yeah, I mean, it failed in a lot of different ways. I think the launch was really poor. It wasn't well thought out. There wasn't a whole lot of good messaging in terms of why they wanted to do this. I think the idea of this being kind of a closed system was really kind of against everything that people in and around European football are about. So I think that was kind of a deal breaker. I think people are fine with more money being pushed to bigger clubs in the Champions League, because they know that's a system that's merit-based, that you have to finish, in the top 5 of your current league, whatever league that is, in terms of qualifying for it. But this idea that clubs are going to break away into their own closed system and they're doing it just for money and just for greed, I think was really short-sighted to assume that, fans and supporters and other clubs would be on board with that. So I think there were so many mistakes that were made. We probably don't have enough time to talk about it here. But yeah, I mean, it was just not well thought out, and it did not. I mean, I'm not obviously surprised it crashed and burned so quickly as it did.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, on the flip side, there has been, commentary, although it has its complication because of the transnational aspect of it. That's something that has been suggested as like a North American league in which you have Mexican, US teams, probably Canadian teams as well, which, is a different beast. But that doesn't seem that preposterous. And actually, you being a player and being involved with football from many years, what's your take on a future, North American Super League?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's different in terms of it would not be a breakaway league. It would be more of kind of a combination of leagues, just like there's discussions between Belgium and Holland or the Scandinavian countries coming together. So I don't see them as kind of the same thing. A lot of people have talked about a North American league, combined league, particularly between the Mexican League and MLS. I'm less high on that actually happening anytime soon. I think there's so many structural differences between the two leagues, right? Mexico has promotion relegation, even though they've paused it. MLS doesn't. MLS is a franchise model. The Mexican League isn't. MLS has a centralized television deal. Mexico has a decentralized television deal where each team negotiates their own TV deal. So at some point, I'm not really necessarily sure how the governance combines together and how that works. Obviously, I think in the long run, it's in the best interest of both leagues to potentially find a way to work together. Mexican soccer is so incredibly popular in North America, and there's so many potential revenue streams, for both leagues to potentially capitalize on that. It's just kind of a no-brainer, but I don't necessarily see it happening anytime soon for the reasons that I described.
And sticking to the point of North America and the US, particularly now that, the World Cup in 26 is going to be a joint effort. And I wanted your take also as a connoisseur of the game, and probably I should start in, where were you in 1994, and how soccer and the World Cup in the US impacted you there. But how do you see this let's say new go at it with this united World Cup, and how do you think will accelerate the momentum that we're seeing from afar that, especially in the US, soccer is getting?
Yeah, I mean, the 94 World Cup really kind of exploded the popularity of the sport in this country. MLS launched, and, it created a visibility in kind of the public sphere in America of the sport that didn't exist before. I think there's an assumption now that the 2026 is just going to continue that growth, and I'm sure it will to a certain extent. And then the question is, where are we going to see that growth? Is that growth going to be in domestic soccer and MLS? Or is that growth going to be in other competitions that are equally, if not more popular, whether that's the Mexican League, whether that's the Premier League, Bundesliga, Serie A, right? All these other leagues. So I'm less inclined to say that it's going to grow necessarily the sport in a sense that's going to grow our domestic league. I think it will help, but I'm more inclined to say that, Americans love seeing the best players in the world and having, the best players, Messi and Ronaldo, assuming they're still playing in 4 years, playing on American soil. I could see that fans being more inclined to watch Barcelona and Juventus than necessarily saying, I'm going to go out to my local MLS match. Now, it's not going to hurt the growth of MLS in American soccer, but because MLS soccer has matured so much in the last 25 years, I don't necessarily see this kind of explosion that maybe some other people have talked about. They think was going to happen after 26.
And actually, talking about popularity, and I've been having conversations and discussions with different peers here in Europe and the US, and actually, it would be interesting to get your take in terms of where do you stack, the popularity of MLS and NWSL in terms of drivers of the homegrown popularity of the game in terms of participation and aspiration, compared to, the foreign leagues that are broadcasted there.
Yeah, I mean, NWSL is still very early in its phase of development. They're still growing. I think it's difficult to say they have much, market share or popularity there yet. I think it has huge potential to grow in the future. I mean, MLS, they have professional academies, and they definitely do drive the growth in terms of more players playing the game. They're certainly a factor, but the Mexican League is by far and away, Liga MX is the most popular league in this country by far. Next is the Premier League, and next is a handful of European leagues. So I still think those leagues, those foreign leagues, are driving the growth of the sport in this country, probably more so than MLS is. Not that MLS is doing anything wrong, just the other leagues are more popular at this time.
Yeah. And I suppose that now the coincidence in time, which it has a different flavor than before. I mean, we've seen American players playing in Europe before, but not to the stature of stardom that they are having now. I think that now, the US is effectively exporting better and much more talent, right, to Europe. And when you see, Christian Pulisic winning the Champions League with Chelsea, and then the week after, the Nations League with the US, and actually celebrating the Champions League with a US soccer sweatshirt, I think that's where kind of the hero creation, the homegrown hero creation process, kind of speeds up the popularity.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think you're seeing more Americans getting in the European environment at younger ages and having, excuse me, a lot of success in Europe and playing in the Champions League. And you can see that on our national team now. Still think we have a ways to go, but I think the growth of the player pool, the talent pool, certainly at the top end, has been pretty significant in the last 5 to 10 years. And so we'll see how the national team does in this cycle. I still think we're obviously many, many years behind similar sized countries in Europe or similar sized soccer nations in Europe. But we've seen a massive growth in that respect, and that can only benefit the growth of the sport in this country.
Yeah, and pretty much in kind of in closing, the idea of the evolution of soccer and the business of soccer, what do you want to see in terms of business here in Europe, in the next 5 to 10 years? I mean, what would be reasonable and a sane set of business practices in terms of running a football club? Because we reckon that actually reckless management or ill-advised investments and so on actually harms everyone else in the ecosystem, right? So what will be an ideal scenario in terms of this influx of foreign investors and the management of it, and to kind of find that balance that you were referring to earlier?
Yeah, I mean, I think more professionalization of clubs that are run better and more efficiently. I don't know if that means certain leagues instituting salary caps in terms of putting restraint on the amount of money you can spend, because that's how clubs get in a lot of trouble. Certain leagues like the UK, they have, fit and proper tests in terms of vetting new owners. I think those kind of structures are probably important to make sure that the right people are getting in positions of ownership of European football clubs. But I think it just comes down to these clubs being run better, more efficiently, and not making poor decisions and not spending more money than they can bring in. And I realize no one can come in and tell a private business owner what to do and what not to do. But I think hopefully COVID, the pandemic, has changed the way people look at running these football clubs to a certain extent, and that they realize, hey, you know what? Like, we can't spend 150% of our revenue on player wages, right? We just can't do that. It's not going to work, right? It doesn't matter how wealthy our owner is. At some point, if we're losing millions of dollars every year, he's going to say no at some point, right? So I think these clubs need to take a hard look in the mirror in terms of the way they're run and the spending decisions that they make. And I'm hopeful that moving into the future, more clubs will be run better and more efficiently.
Definitely. And representing in the last one, what do you take in terms of now the influx, not only, we discuss about ownership and equity plays and acquisitions, right? But there has been an uptick in debt financing operations, especially coming, also with American capital, but just looking at, helping clubs here, surpass especially the cash flow problems that they've been facing, I would say, from the pandemic, but, we know that some of those actually come from way back. Do you see that from the investment perspective as a feasible, business play from the capital markets, especially because you pretty much have 2 or 3 assets that can be collateralized to support that debt?
No, I think debt financing in the sport is very problematic. Obviously, some of it has been out of necessity with the pandemic, but a lot of it is just being done to leverage potential assets at the club, whether that club owns their stadium or their cash in the bank or whatnot. So I think a lot of potential foreign investors or foreign investors currently use debt financing as creative ways not to put as much money as they want into the club, which to a certain extent is understandable. But if you don't have enough money to run a football club in Europe, you shouldn't buy a football club. You should not be heavily debt financing the club, because that just, you start digging a hole day one in terms of buying a club. And it's hard enough to run these clubs without adding significant layers of debt. And then if and when you're looking to exit, it's incredibly difficult to exit clubs. No one's going to buy a club with huge amounts of debt. So that creates situations where clubs go bankrupt. That creates situations where clubs are relegated multiple times. So it creates a negative cycle. And so I think debt financing out of necessity because of the pandemic is one thing, but other forms of debt in this industry are really problematic in my mind.
All right. Jordan, thank you very much for your time. This has been quick and very efficient, and it shows how you run things. I really thank you for being with us in this chapter of Intersections, and I look forward to speak again soon, hopefully, in the middle of another successful season next year with Helsingør.
Cool. Thanks. Appreciate it.
This episode is brought to you, as always, by The Connect. The Connect is Raide Luis Baez. Follow the Intersection podcast in your favorite podcasting platform. Leave us a review and share it with a friend. This will really help us be found by more of you interested in the topics of sports marketing and deal making. Until the next one.